Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is May 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Patrick McGee. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay.
We're going to discuss the search for identity and in regards to movies and violence. So, I wanted to tell you, maybe you didn't know this, but in 1924, D.W. Griffith, who pretty much, I think you'd agree, sort of invented the feature film.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, you'd agree. He said, literally, he said this in 1924. In the year 2024, the most important single thing that the cinema will have helped in a large way to accomplish be eliminating from the face of the civilized world all armed conflict. Now, first of all, do you believe D.W. Griffith said that? I mean, I read it in a book.
I don't know, but I mean it's possible. I mean, people believe all kinds of stuff. I mean, James Joyce thought that Finnegan's Wake, if people would read Finnegan's Wake, it would have prevented World War II.
Wait, say that again. People have said that?
Yeah, I've read it too. I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly which. It's in a lot of Joyce studies, but Joyce in biographies. I mean, Joyce once made the comment that if people read and understood Finnegan's Wake, it would have prevented the next war.
Joyce actually said that.
Yeah, he actually said something to that effect. I don't remember the exact wording,
It would have prevented war. That's amazing. And what had the Wake been out already?
Well, the Wake came out in 39?
In 39.
I forget myself. Yeah.
So
I don't remember when he made the statement. I think he actually made it while he was writing it.
Right, while he was writing it.
That because you have to remember he got a lot of pushback from different people who thought he had gone over the edge.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, but one of them said it's like syphilis or whatever. But we know all the disservices of the Wake, having studied it, both of us, for years. But it's interesting you brought up Joyce right off the bat, because Eisenstein and Joyce were going to make a movie of Ulysses. Did you know that? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I know that or not. It sounds familiar, but I don't remember it. Yeah.
But let's just stay on this for a second, this violence. I mean, what D.W. Griffith is saying is interesting, because films can't really do anything, is what Sidney Lumet said. We brought this up in our last discussion. I said, Sidney Lumet says, films can't really do anything, but it's not going to keep me from trying. And he made socially aware, his films were social issues. Uh-huh. But what McLuhan's whole study was called causality. Mm-hmm. So, I sort of think that cinema, being 130 years old, has been a part of the industrial military complex. That cinema has really desensitized people to violence. So I think it's interesting that of all the people, D.W. Griffith would say that it sounds like he's hoping that cinema would help. He says help eliminate warfare or armed conflict, which I like that idea. And I think it's a powerful statement. But let's go to the meat of it. Do you think violence is more innate or more invented in humans?
Well, I think it's innate. Aggression, I think, is a part of our makeup. I don't think that means we have to be aggressive or that we have to be violent. But it's something that, again, like I think I was saying last time, that we continually expand, we elaborate. I mean, and we also, to use the Freudian term, we also sublimate our drives, towards violence. And I think a lot of creative tendencies in human beings have to do with how we learn not to be violent, to channel those kinds of impulses into other modes of expression. So, but yeah, I do think there's an innate aggressiveness in human beings. I mean, I don't see any way we can avoid that conclusion. Unfortunately, just when we think we've got it under control, or when we think we're getting better, or something horrible will happen to remind us that, that it doesn't take much to get the whole thing started again, and I think that's kind of what we see going on now. Can I relate that to movies, though? I mean, there's some of the stuff you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, you can do whatever you want. This is a free for all.
Yeah.
So I don't want it to be just me asking you questions, but feel free to go wherever you want.
Yeah. The issue of violence in movies. I actually went to a conference on that once in Colorado, and it's one that's interesting to me because, I think I mentioned this last time. I have like certain films that I see as sort of like my primal movies, and because I saw them when I was very young, and they just had this strange effect on me, and it sort of stuck with me the rest of my life. And one of them, of course, was Shane, the movie Shane. And I think people my age, a lot of us have had that experience, saw that film when we were like anywhere from 5 to 10, or whatever. And here's a movie in which, the gun is almost fetishized, the whole idea of the weapon, and so forth. At the same time, I've never been violent. I mean, I've when I was a kid, I had my share of fights and things of that sort. Yeah. But it's never been something of great interest to me. I don't think anyone could have called me a bully. And, I've never, ever had the desire for a gun, to own a gun, or to have a gun anywhere near me. I mean, one time, this was when I was kind of involved with left-wing movements back in the 60s and early 70s, because we were in the South, and there was, actually had been threats against us, coming from some kind of group in Arkansas that was, right wing or whatever. And some guy was trying to teach me how to shoot a rifle, like it would have done any good. And, I just never have gotten into that impulse. And yet I have my own aggressions. I mean, I'm someone who can be very combative in discourse, and you said earlier, referred to McLuhan arguing that the alternative to violence may be dialogue. And I rather agree with that. But here's the thing, as I see it, is that there's no question that cinema can cut in so many different directions, and it can be used in so many different ways. And I have no doubt that films that I look at, that I have, that they are violent, and I watch violent films. I watch ultra violent films. I watch, you referred to Quentin Tarantino in that way last time we talked. And I mean, I even watch those films with Keanu Reeves and Liam Neeson. And, they're not the greatest movies ever made, but I find them interesting,
Yeah.
But I don't want to go outside and beat somebody up afterwards,
Right.
But that's just one person. I know that they can be used that way. Yeah. And in teaching violence in the cinema with my students would, when I used to teach it, say, well, what's the alternative to censorship? I mean, if we can't censor what people watch, what are we supposed to do? I mean, if we know these things can happen, and my response was usually, we can teach it. We can teach people how to look at these things. And I learned this interesting fact. What was the name of that place in Colorado where the big shooting took place? The name escapes me at the moment, though.
Yeah, I can't think of it either, but it
was. Okay. But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's a famous mass shooting.
Right, and 2 boys. And I learned that there was a teacher there who was teaching like I guess an honors class or an advanced class or something, and he had taught the movie by Bernardo Bertolucci, Novecento, 1900.
Yes.
You know, and which I'm assuming he probably taught the shorter version of it, but everything horrifying is pretty much in that version too. And there was, a lot of gruesome violence in that movie. Nothing like actually these ultra violent films now, but it's more shocking, like the murder of a child and so forth.
Yeah.
Brutal murder of a child. And he was, I think, almost fired. I think he challenged it. It was a big deal. And I just found it very interesting that this very Columbine. That's I think
Columbine. Yes, Columbine. Yep.
That this school that had this problem was trying to stop the teaching of something that was terrifying, that was violent, that with the idea that this somehow maybe promotes violence. But it seemed to me that teaching this sort of thing to get people to start analyzing themselves, to start understanding how they relate to it was a better solution than trying to prevent it from existing. And then there's another solution. You talk about in your work, experimental cinema,
Yeah.
My idea is, I don't want to censor or try to block cinema, any kind of cinema. But at the same time, it's a good idea to have alternative modes of cinema.
Yeah.
To have ways of creating financial support so that other people can make movies and have some way of distributing those movies. So that a different kind of cinema can exist. And in that way, it's not so much that you're going to force the alteration of human taste, but, you give people more options. They may discover that there's other kinds of art that they appreciate more than violence, or at least they would look at the violent film perhaps in a different light when there are different alternative, modes of visual expression. So, but I don't go along with the idea that cinema, somehow is or not just cinema, obviously, but TV, everything is somehow responsible for the violence of our society, because I think the violence of our society has much deeper roots than that. But it filters into it. In other words, anything that's in our society is going to symptomize itself in our works of art. So anyway, I'm rambling on here. But.
No, you're not rambling. You really you summed up our whole 2 hours together, Patrick, and now we can shut it off, because it's like, what can we do about this? But I'm not gonna hit the end button, because you brought up so many important things, because you right off the bat said dialogue's important and censorship isn't important. But I imagine you have what's your feelings on ratings? Like, do ratings help? Like, do you want a 5-year-old to be able to go see sex, drugs, and violence in a big movie? I saw Bambi, first big movie experience for me growing up. My mom took me probably when I was 5 or 8-ish, and I fell asleep, which I always think was great, because I probably missed all the violence, and that's why I became a pacifist, and that's a form of violence. But I mean, there's so many directions. I wanted to just throw out these two ideas just off the bat, because I do have a bias, and I've learned from studying McLuhan is suspended judgment. Understand the big picture. Understanding is not having a point of view. But when you're with one or more people, you don't say, I don't like violent films. When you're alone in your house, you can say, I don't watch violent films. But you want to be able to understand why people watch it, and why. My big thing is why every movie billboard has a gun in your face practically. Mm-hmm. It's like, so I understand that's merchandising, getting people to understand what brings people into the movie theater. But the two questions, just sort of to suss out, I would love to hear, because you talk about a zeitgeist, and there's so many causes. It's not just the kid went and saw this the teacher showed him 1900. It desensitized him to violence, and it caused him to shoot his fellow students.
No, they weren't saying. Nobody said that.
No, I know nobody.
Yeah.
I know nobody said that, but I'm just saying, we studying causality, we tend to want to know what caused that. You know, and so they go, well, the kids were on some sort of drugs, not like psych drugs. Their parents. So gave them these drugs because they were hyperactive or whatever. So there's many layers. There's much more to the zeitgeist than saying it's this. So the two things I'd like to explore here are, one is, does watching violent films more alleviate our need to be aggressive or cause us to be aggressively violent? And you already addressed it in saying, my fellow 60s anti-war protester was saying, Patrick, you got to learn. And you're like, no, I don't want to learn how to use a gun. And you didn't become a gun owner and a violent person with guns by watching violent films, because you said, I didn't. I learned how to be aggressively, get my aggression out in other ways. So that's one thing I want to explore. And in that, I'll just put part two is, so being someone who grew up in the 70s with cinema, when I was born in 53, but I hit college, and at our film society, we're showing Bonnie and Clyde, the first big splash of violence. We're showing Sam Peckinpah. We're showing Taxi Driver, and we're going, this is high art. And then after that, I just said, okay, I had enough of that. I don't want to watch violent films. And I grew to hate what Clint Eastwood stands for. Make my day. It's like, dude, he's a great filmmaker, and I hate him because of what he's done. Now, it's not a legitimate hate. I don't prefer to see his films, and I might be missing out because he's an important filmmaker. So I got this DVD once, and it was the history of literature. And they said basically from day one, all literature was people cutting each other up and killing each other. So my big question. So my big question was, Jerry, that's a little ironic because you like literature, but does literature, since it's a different experience than cinema, is it affect us differently, and it affect me differently in saying violence, if I read violent books, does it desensitize me to violence? Does it alleviate me more of being violent with a gun or a knife, or does it cause me to gravitate towards that as a means? So,
well, I guess, I don't know, the way I would see those questions is, as to what, I'm not a psychologist, and I don't want to, get into an argument with psychologists about what does or doesn't desensitize people. But I have a rather non-psychological way of looking at it, I think, which is that, I told you before that for me, even visual art forms like cinema and photography and so forth and so on are acts of thought. It's that French philosopher Gilles Deleuze talked about Hitchcock's movies as, he didn't see Hitchcock as the most advanced person, but he saw Hitchcock as like a hinge between early cinema and then this idea of a really advanced cinema, which I don't totally agree with. But anyway, his idea about Hitchcock's work is that it is the thinking image, and that it's an image that I don't know if he means expresses a thought or is a thought. But it's the same. That is sort of the same thing in my view. But in Hitchcock's films, like people there was a lot of controversy when Hitchcock did Psycho, for example. A lot of people thought, oh my God, look at the violence against women. And Hitchcock has been paying for that ever since. I mean, they're still talking about that. And there's no question that, for example, if you look at Hitchcock's oeuvre, there's a lot of violence against women. I mean, it's in one form or another, But I would make a distinction. I mean, I think that there are films, even films that I might enjoy for one weird reason or another, that if I look at the overall expression, are kind of glorifying violence. There's no question about it. I mean, they're taking vengeance, for example, as a kind of a way of capturing the audience, because everyone's got something they're angry about. Everyone's got something they'd like to get even with, that they would like to have some vengeance for. And so you live it vicariously through the cinema, but it's more than just vicarious in a sense, because the cinema, because of the sound and the music and the intensity of it, can really create the sense of that. However, I make a distinction, these are all very different movies. I mean, Bonnie and Clyde, for example, when I saw Bonnie and Clyde, I think I saw it twice, because I think I saw it when it first came out in '67, and then it was re-released early the next year, because it wasn't really doing that well at first or something. I can't remember what the story is, and I remember I saw that movie downtown Memphis, took the bus home, I was still living with my parents, went into the house, went to the bathroom. We had one bathroom in that house, shut the door and wept. I mean, I just wept.
Wow.
And I was just like, it was almost like I was shattered, and it wasn't because, of course, the violence in that movie can be very ironic at times. And you can't take it as some sort of realistic portrait of the actual people. But for me, it was what it did. It was something that, a director you like, Sidney Lumet, I think does in a different way, but it's also central to his oeuvre, which is this destroying, a clear-cut sense of what is right and wrong, what is justice and injustice, and plus, see, I grew up, I'm a little older than you. Yeah. And I grew up watching all these old movies on TV. And I actually think I thought I lived during the Great Depression, because, I saw, Fugitive from a Chain Gang and all these movies about gangsters, the Public Enemy. I never saw Scarface because that wasn't on those TV packages, but I saw it later. But plenty of other movies to fit the bill. The Roaring Twenties with Jimmy Cagney, so forth and so on. And
you probably saw a lot of Bogart.
Yeah, and even the early Bogart that he wasn't a romantic figure. And seeing that movie, it was like I was watching those movies again, but suddenly I saw them in a totally different way. It was like, it was just this. For me, it was like it opened up the nightmare of American history, the socioeconomic realities that lay behind these things. And even though it might have, I certainly wouldn't argue with someone who said, well, I kind of romanticized these two criminals. To me, what it did was made them very, very human.
Yeah.
It's, so that was one thing. But then in another context, I've seen films, and I may even enjoy them, that I do something very opposite to that. They simply are really exploiting the audience, the nervous system, to get you kind of into it, and that is problematic. I just have a different idea of how one gets away from that, from rather than censorship. But go ahead. I'm sorry to.
No, Patrick, it's really beautiful, because I just want to jump in for a second, because the example is, I know that Errol Morris's film Fog of War is an excellent documentary. And I think Errol is a very good filmmaker, and it was very important for us to hear McNamara admit he's a war criminal. But it humanized a war criminal. And I've always wanted to talk to Errol about this. And we rehearsed how we were going to ask him once at a public screening. And it's never happened where I can talk to him direct. And he's pretty intelligent about talking about his films.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke with my wife's dad, who was a therapist and a social worker who worked with Cesar Chavez and the Black Panthers, just a really right on great human. And I said, that film humanized a war criminal. And David said, humanizing anyone is a good thing. And it was like, to me, saying we're all capable of doing evil. We're all capable of failing and even going overboard and killing people. So how do we deal with that? How do we cope with that? So I think I really wanted to pursue why you were weeping, and you said the word because it humanized him. But I would like to go into that deeper. You were feeling that there's nothing we could do about this, and that's why you were weeping, or just sort of like, what was the crying for? Because it touched me deeply that you did that.
I don't know that I really know.
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, but I think just because all I can do is sort of look back and at this point in my life and, hypothesize why it got to me so emotionally. And I still love that movie, even though it doesn't have the force anymore that it had at that time for me, I just think it wasn't that I was completely naive, but I was much more naive than I later became. Yeah. And I just think it was the way in which it altered the moral ethical framework within which I was looking at this kind of historical moment, So I knew that I was, you could watch movies in which the bad guy was the hero, and sometimes, he was a good bad guy. That's very typical in the Western, the good bad guy, and so forth and so on. But this was different. The movie sucked you in. It got you into these characters.
Yeah.
At the same time, you could see that the things that weren't right, that weren't making any sense, and you knew they were doomed. But when you saw them obliterated, and when you saw the legal process, which is not that focused on, but it's there, and the implicit cruelty of it, and it was just more shocking than any film about that topic I'd seen up to that point. And then a Sidney Lumet film, and I'm willing to say, by the way, that Sidney Lumet's approach to this very same problematic may be much more powerful ultimately and much more intellectually rich because there is a kind of romance in Bonnie and Clyde, but whereas Lumet just digs right into this, the way in which crime and policing intersect, and justice, and just the political dimension of it, the way in which processes become political acts, that aren't necessarily directly related to trying to achieve justice. And but the thing is I saw Bonnie and Clyde long before I saw, I'd seen earlier films of his, but not the ones that really blew me away in the 70s. Yeah. So I don't know. I just think it's a film that awakened something in me,
No, it was really well put, and it's deep that you said it. And it's really not that I'm a fan of Sidney Lumet. I love to study cinema, but I love that he said that because he was articulate. Some filmmakers, I'll tell you, the other filmmaker who's like the counter Marty is Brian De Palma. That guy is like not so violent in my opinion, but early on, him and Marty were peers. But if you see the De Palma documentary of him talking for 90 minutes, it's really good because he's articulate. So that's what I find intriguing about what we're doing is we're trying to be articulate about feelings, and you saying alter your moral ethical framework, that's dialogue. That is trying to suss out with spoken word how your feeling of crying was. But I was going to say the justice term you brought up is also fun to bring in. Easy Rider, which is happening about the same time, and it's not justice, it's rednecks killing hippies, you know. And it's like the same ending. Oh no, not another ballet of blood flying across the screen. So I mean, and it's all good. I mean, it's beautiful that we can analyze these films, but I'm, you know, and there was a couple topics we could go into, like with the tetrad, of which things are invented. But I'm curious because you brought up Deleuze, the acts of thought, that film and photography is an act of thought. That why is it that humans aren't so I don't know the right verb there, let's just say affected by violence in literature as they are in film? Maybe it's because if we're talking 5 major senses, we know there's more. That a neuroscientist came to one of our meetings once and said that the sense of sight is the most dominant sense. So you're still reading, you're reading words that could be tackling violence, but when you see blood on the screen, just maybe discuss that difference. Is there really a difference? Because when I read that, when I saw that documentary and it said, dude, everything's been violent in literature, why don't you have a bias towards violent literature, you know? So any thoughts on that regard?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the visual is the dominant sense, but the thing about cinema, particularly now, I mean, in the last 40 years or so, you know, is that it is almost, I mean, what's the word? You know, they used to use that word, I can't remember, for Wagner's operas, you know, but where you've got,
I mean, total theater.
Yeah, I mean, where you've got music, sound effects,
everything,
everything, and you know, it can be done in a playful way, like in a movie like Star Wars or something, you know. Although even there, I mean, you know, you see somebody annihilate an entire planet, an entire world. I mean, it's just, but you don't actually see what's happening to people, you know. But I think the visceral experience of it is incredible. You know, if I can give another sort of anecdotal example, though, I mean, on the one hand, I remember when I was young, you know, like maybe 10, 11, 12 in that area, and they started coming out with the James Bond movies, you know? And like I know I missed the first one and the second one, but I saw Goldfinger. That was the first one I saw. And I started reading some of the Ian Fleming novels, you know, because they were easy to read. They were short.
Good example.
And you know, they're violent, but they're not violent the way ultra violent movies are today. I mean, or even the James Bond movies of today. But I remember walking out of the theater, and I'm probably 12, 13 years old, and just, you know, it isn't so much that I'm imitating, is that I'm just feeling this, like, this guy's so cool, you know, and you know, there is this kind of weird identification imprint that it makes on you. But you know, at some point you start outgrowing that. I don't know. I mean, it's you learn to enjoy something that you know is really kind of silly. You know, the same way that people can be very, very serious, but they like detective novels, you know, because it's a kind of entertainment, you know. Although these days we turn every form of entertainment into something to be studied, and which is, I don't have a problem with that either. I think, because I think all these things do have particular qualities. So I don't know. I mean, I just think this you were talking last time, we mentioned Tarantino and ultraviolence. I mean, I don't find Tarantino's violence uncritical. I find it very interesting in the way he does it, and but it can seem shocking. I mean, he really will go, like in the Hateful Eight. He really went quite far in a kind of almost misogynist element, and I don't think it meant that he was a misogynist, but he was trying to lay something out, in the film. At least that's how I see it, and but I don't want to sound like I'm justifying it either, because I can understand someone feeling that, or suggesting that that's all well and good, but how come these films can get the money to be made and then another film can't? Because it doesn't have that kind of visceral, I'm gonna shock the hell out of you, and so forth. Another thing too is I'm a big fan of Martin Scorsese.
Yeah.
I mean, I consider him almost numero uno in terms of American directors, perhaps even of all time, And part of what I love about Scorsese, I think it's true, and even in his early work, but it becomes shockingly true after the video era, and I think we mentioned that briefly last time.
Yeah.
But, there's kind of a beat to his movies, and I was watching a little documentary the other night, and someone said I think it was his editor, Thelma Schooner, I can't forget.
Yeah.
That's how he operates. He actually sees a rhythm in the sequence of images, and then he puts music to it, and but there is a kind of intensity, and one could argue you get lost in it almost. You can't keep up with it, but at the same time, where it's going, his portrait, for example, of gangsters is hardly. There might be an exception to that in the Gangs of New York, but it's hardly, the kind of relative romantic vision that you get in the Godfather movies.
Well, I wanted to tell you my reaction to Marty, because I love Marty off the bat. I mean, talk about beat. He puts Smokey Robinson's song "Mickey's Monkey" in Mean Streets, and it was just like pinnacle for me in the 70s. This is the ultimate. Then it's all blood, and I'm like, give me a break. And then, Bernard Herrmann in Taxi Driver, it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then it's like, oh no. And then, then he puts even this, the movie about the crazy guy on the island, which is more recent, and it's all John Cage soundtrack. I mean,
I know. Actually, I love that, because it was a way of getting into
it's amazing.
serial music.
and he made a documentary on Cubism, how it affected cinema, and cinema affected Cubism. I agree with you, but I sort of went on this rant after leaving Ann Arbor and showing films for 8 years there and coming to LA, that Marty worked for the mob, and that the mob had financed all his films, and all he does is romanticize the mob his whole career. And I sort of did it as a joke for me to discount feeling obliged to watch every movie because it was the mob shooting people again. So that's an unfair bias that I held on to. And this is what I need, is someone like you to say, this is why Marty's an important filmmaker. So is he more a mirror? So it's like, you don't blame the messenger. This is the cliche. Don't blame the messenger. He's just laying it out and saying, you decide. But again, it is deciding subject matter. So when, Marty does Méliès's film, I'm like, oh, I forgive him now.
Well, so he does periodically stop and do something else. But
right.
I mean, I can't explain. I mean, it's like the question, I think I mentioned last time, is that why does somebody like, Jacques Lacan write in ways that are so difficult for people to understand. You know,
Right.
why do artists choose to do the things they do?
Do,
You know,
yeah.
why do they focus on the things they do? And I don't have a clear-cut answer to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, all I can say is that what I would like to see is not to stop this person from their vision, but rather to have, you know, a space for more visions. But I know that in order to do that, we would probably also inadvertently divert money from those kinds of projects. And you know, I mean, if you go back and you read James Fenimore Cooper, I mean, there's, you know, there's violence. If you read Moby Dick, you know, when Scorsese made Age of Innocence, you know, that film just amazed me and still does to this day. But it amazed me precisely because if he had not made Goodfellas beforehand, you know, and all the other movies, and then made that movie, if he had not made those other movies, I wouldn't have seen that movie the way I saw it. But because he had made those movies, I saw that movie, and I love the novel, Edith Wharton, and I was astonished. I mean, I was asking myself, what did he do that was different from the novel? And the only answer I could come up with was the camera and the way the camera moved, because it was like Edith Wharton kind of was comfortable in that world. So we have her voice over in the film, done by, you know, Paul Newman's wife. I can't think of her name.
Joanne Woodward.
Yeah, I think she did the voiceover for that.
Yeah.
And but like, you know, when the camera's going into these, you know, rooms with the paintings on the walls and so forth and so on, most of us have never lived in a world like that.
Yeah.
We don't know these people. And neither does Scorsese. He didn't grow up in a world like that either. So he's kind of a spy, you know, in the house. He's a spy in this world. And but what we see is the same logic, you know, the same kind of logic that produces gangsterism and monstrosity of one sort or another. You know, in this case, it's more like a class elite world, you know. And you know, the other night I watched this, what I thought was actually kind of an awful show. It was where was it? It was I guess it was on Prime or something. You know, it's this thing about this. Can't even remember the name of it now. It's about this woman who marries this Scottish man who. You know, who's wealthy and has some kind of title, you know, and she becomes a duchess, but she also has all these relationships to royalty and so forth and so on. And UK is supposed to be based on a true story. And what was, it almost sickened me because I was watching this woman get systematically destroyed by this man. And at the same time, she was doing it to herself because she kept making one mistake after another. I mean, she committed these sort of little sins, you know, little deceptions, trying to protect herself and save her marriage and so on and so on. And this guy just destroyed her. And to me, that was more violent than a lot of very violent films I see, because first off, because it felt real, and it was supposedly real. So I just think that.
You mean it was violent without blood? It was
there's no blood in it.
Verbal abuse or just psychological abuse?
Psychological abuse, but also legal abuse. In other words, what the film foregrounds is that this woman, even though she was rich and upper class and so forth and so on, really had no rights, you know, because she liked sex. That was also a part of it. And because she liked sex, there were things they could dig up on her, you know, and use. I mean, it was just, you know, you've seen these things before, these shocking portraits of the British legal system back in the 50s and 60s and so forth. But so, I mean, there's just, you know, all kinds of violence that comes out in film, and the visual medium can make it gut wrenching in a way that if you were reading it in a book, you might be outraged. But you probably take it in differently. You're not taking it in so fast. And
well, it's good, Patrick, you talked about Age of Innocence because
mm-hmm.
you specifically said, I read the book and I saw the movie. And you know, McLuhan and Hitchcock's favorite joke is two goats are eating cinema, film, 35 millimeter film in the back lot, right over here in Culver City at MGM, coming out of the film can. And one goat turns to the other and goes, the book was better.
Well, I never say that. I never, ever say that. Right. I taboo that from my speech.
Good. And you
because
take each in their own medium and you discuss them. And this is, again, what we're after is the big picture. And I think what you said is why the artist chooses their topic is a good point, a good time to just inject these two quotes I got recently, both from women. And one of them is from Jay Paulson, our mutual friend who introduced us. And he told me that this poet, Fanny Howe, said, the point of art to show that life is worth living by showing that it isn't. which is an ironic, and I'm glad you laughed because it's an ironic statement. It's a female poet. And this is important because you talked about how the male has dominated this so much. And then Yoko Ono said, the job of an artist is not to destroy, but to change the value of things. And by doing that, artists can change the world into a utopia where there is total freedom for everybody.
Well, now, sounds a little optimistic to me.
It's very optimistic, and it's also like big picture. But it's amazing that to think that we can change the value of things in a movie, in a story, telling the story, we change the value. And in real life, it might not change it.
Yeah.
You know, it's
but
like,
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, those things, I don't know about the utopia thing, but the problem is I don't think the artist can set out to do that. And this is something that is a conundrum when you're talking about the aesthetic, because I don't, the artist, has lived a life. He has interests, he has conflicts, he has, unconscious desires and conscious desires, all the things that every human being has. And he has some ability to make something, whether it's a film or write a book or whatever. And I don't like the word gifts very much, but obviously some people can do certain things better than other people. And that's a reality, but I don't think they can set out to like, okay, I'm going to do this and to change the world and it'll work this way, and so forth and so on. Because, the things that have a huge impact, like the way Bonnie and Clyde had an impact on me, or, the first time I saw Sidney Lumet's The Pawnbroker. Yeah. When I watch it now, it doesn't really have that force anymore. But when I saw it, when it came out, and I was about, 16, 17, somewhere in that area, I was just, blitzed by that movie. I mean, it just annihilated me, in the sense of, human suffering and the fact that there were events that even then I didn't fully know everything about. I didn't know enough to fully appreciate it, but I certainly knew it had happened. And to start getting an image of that, it's just something that film can do that is gives it enormous power, and therefore perhaps there should be some degree of responsibility. But how one defines responsibility is always going to be different. I think, for example, that I suspect that Scorsese thinks of himself as a very responsible filmmaker, and I'm a Brian De Palma fan. I got to be honest with you,
Oh
and
yeah,
and
well,
and it because what he does visually, I'm mesmerized when I watch one of his films. And
totally. De Palma's like didn't get the let's say the praise that Marty's gotten, and Marty's got excelled. But did you see the De Palma doc where he talks about film
yeah, I
for?
saw it. Yeah,
And I found him very,
excellent.
he's very articulate. But I guess it's interesting because I don't want to diss this guy, but whoever his last name is, I don't know. Todd, the guy who made the Joker with
Todd Haynes, is it? I think. Is it
not
Todd
Todd,
Haynes?
not Todd Haynes, the guy who made the Joker.
Yeah, you didn't like that movie.
Well, no, here's the thing. I saw it with him speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Like we go to the Writers Guild, it's really fun because you got 200 sort of failed screenwriters watching a film, and then the filmmaker has to talk, and it's like, boy, they got to talk to their peer group and say, yeah, I got a lucky break here. I made a film that it eventually made it probably was successful, but I felt that he went to NYU, just like Marty and Brian did. He calculated it, and he made a documentary on the sickest punk rocker ever, Gigi Allen. And I studied his sort of progress in filmmaking, but that film felt to me like it was so calculated to manipulate you. And maybe I didn't surrender to the experience. That's part of the problem for anybody like us, and I don't know if it is for you really, is that how do you break that I'm going to watch this critically and suss out what it's doing to me, or just surrender to the experience and let the experience, because see, you did that with you talked about it with Bonnie and Clyde, and you talked about it with the pawnbroker. And then it sounds like you continue to you're able to do that.
To some extent, I think you're absolutely right. I think I do surrender, but then I think it through. And I'm a great, you refer to Jay. I know his dad, and his dad. We always have this argument about not an argument, but this difference, about he doesn't. His father tends not to want to watch movies more than once. I watch movies over and over and over again.
Yeah,
even to the point where they kind of lose, they really do lose their
impact.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably. In fact,
right.
Cinema is kind of like trauma. It hits you, and it sort of, you can't even begin to process it, like being in a car accident or something.
Yeah,
and then then you go to therapy or something and you talk it over and repeat the story over and over again. And bit by bit, it ceases to have that force. But then you develop another kind of, critical perception.
Yeah.
That, that you begin to understand why it did that, or you begin, I mean, like I said, it's hard for me to explain the Bonnie and Clyde experience because I was so young. And
how many years after was Pawnbreaker after Bonnie and Clyde, though?
I'm not even sure if it was after. It may have even been before.
Before.
Sometimes I look up these movies and I am surprised to see when they actually came out. Because it was roughly in the same era. I think it was
same era. But Shane was like more when you're 5 or 8.
Shane came out in 1953, and I saw it. I remember seeing it at a drive-in. I mean, I was really little. I think I saw it probably a couple of times, once I was writing this, I've got this sort of memoir novel that I wrote some years ago, and I intend to go back to it someday. But and it was kind of a memoir through films. Films were sort of the underlying thing. It wasn't the only thing, but one of the underlying things. And I actually went to the library and dug out those tapes and was going through. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I was going through all the film sections, the advertisements for movies. And I did it for from around 1953 or 4 all the way up until the mid 60s, to see when the movies played at theaters. And I made some surprising discoveries. For example, my memory is that I saw Rebel Without a Cause many times, but I realized that I could not have seen it more than once or twice. I mean, a couple of times, because it really didn't show at theaters. I mean, there was there were some theaters that were rerun theaters, and first run theaters, but those films just didn't show that frequently,
But they reverberated more intensely in your memory than other films.
Absolutely. I mean, Rebel Without a Cause is another one of my primal films, and
that's good. I'm glad you said that, because I was part of that movement in the 70s that's called nurturing the cult film, or enabling it. And that was King of Hearts and Harold and Maude.
Oh, love those movies.
In both of those movies, what we were hearing, someone's watched Harold and Maude 200 times. They weren't watching on VHS or on TV. They were going to the theater and watching it 200 times. What we were understanding finally was there really wasn't a period pre that where people watched movies multiple times that was documented. I mean, maybe someone went and saw some Fred Astaire film a lot of times, but it wasn't documented as a phenomenon. And then
you might have been able to do that, in LA or New York easier,
right.
But when you're in a less,
urban, in the big city. But it is an interesting phenomenon, because that's like rereading a book, and you read about Harold Bloom or these lit crits who talk about what book can you reread, or constantly reading. Back to Joyce. I mean, I've been studying The Wake for 25 years, and I don't see any purpose in stop studying it. And now we're studying Ulysses, and I can't get into Ulysses. I found something in The Wake, like a movie, that I can repeat. It doesn't matter. I keep returning to it.
Yeah.
And that's a different experience, because that's reading a book out loud with a group of people, which is similar to cinema. You're sharing it with people. It's not an individual thing. Whereas cinema is an individual thing, but you're usually in a room with many people. But now it's all changed, because we can study cinema with a DVD.
Absolutely.
When I watch a film with my wife, we go, wait, what was that line? We're constantly interrupting a 2-hour experience to go to the bathroom, to get something to eat, or to go, wait, I want to hear that line again. What did they say?
Well, when you're writing on it too. I mean, when I'm writing on films, I will actually, have to go back and look. Fortunately, I have, still have a DVD drive on my computer, my laptop.
Yeah.
And although lately I've been working on my iPad, so I don't do that. But I haven't been writing on film lately. But and I'll just click up and go through and look for the piece I'm trying to remember. The other thing too, is that when I did a lot of research on film history and film criticism and stuff like that, it was very interesting, because that's a recent thing. I mean, it's within my lifetime that film studies became a scholarly pursuit. And one of the things that I really found amusing was that these early film critics, some of them were just great, but they get things wrong. They don't remember certain scenes clearly. And it's easy to understand why, because you watch a movie, and then you go home, and then you have to I went to see, after Titanic came out, I decided I was going to write this article about Titanic, and I was going to write this big article, and I did. It was quite long. I actually published it in an electronic journal, and then later it's a chapter in a book. And I would go back to see it with a notebook, and I was sitting there making notes in the dark, because trying to capture things, trying to get away from simply being caught up in the experience and figure out what it is I was seeing in the film, and that I felt everyone's really seeing, but they're not articulating it. They're not recognizing exactly what's going in. And this is something that we can do now, much more easily. And I mean, literally much more easily, particularly since DVD, because VHS was a little more clunky to deal with, a little bit harder to go back and forth, whereas DVD and Blu-ray is very easy to deal with.
Very easy. Yeah.
I was in LA writing a book on the Western, and I went to Los Angeles and to do some research, and I went to the that Cinema Academy thing. I forget the name of it. And
Mary Herrick library,
right?
Academy library. It's amazing library.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I looked at the original screenplay with notes and director's notes of Shane and stuff like that. But one of the things I found most interesting is that there were some movies I just couldn't see, and I really felt like I needed to see them. And most of them, I had to go to the UCLA Film Archives, and they would give me these VHS tapes. And these tapes were so horrible. I mean, it was just awful. I was like, I'd be watching movies all day, and I'd have a headache, and they're just terrible. The colors were all shot. I mean, it was just awful. And then, but there was this one movie they didn't have because it had never been converted at that time, to VHS. And for some reason, DVDs, I don't think were out yet. But even when they came out, they didn't want to do DVDs for some reason. So they sent me over to this place. It was a former studio. It was somewhere in Hollywood. I don't remember exactly where. And I went there, and it was the only time I ever worked with one of those, I forgot what you call them now, the machines where you have the actual film in the machine and then a little screen, and you're watching a movie, and it was a movie with Gregory Peck called Yellow Sky. It was a Western. Yeah. And I realized that for a long time, only somebody who had access to this kind of machine could actually get a clear image of these films. And there's a name for these things, but I forget it. I wish I could remember. My memory's getting bad these days.
You mean it's like a film chain? It's you run a 16 millimeter film through a chain to turn it into video.
Yeah, I think it's actually
a moviola.
I think it might have been a 32 millimeter film.
Yeah, it could have been a moviola, but let's just.
I think that's what it was actually. I think
it's a moviola. Yeah, it sounds like a moviola, and it's interesting. Let's just go back for a second because I like what you said about film criticism and when it started, and when it got really serious. Because I think, I coming up in film studies starting in mid 70s, especially in Ann Arbor, Michigan, we were aware of the power of Pauline Kael. And then it took years before I realized how important Manny Farber was. And these were people who were great writers. So you didn't have to agree with them or not. They were using the printed medium to talk about the visual medium, and they were great writers. So you could just appreciate their writing as writers. And so that raised the bar. And now I love like Rotten Tomatoes because you watch a film and I go, am I supposed to like this or not? So I see what 20 critics say, and then I go, oh yeah, I probably feel that way. I let the critics tell me because I'm not always sure. And like, this was McLuhan's great statement. There's no such thing as a good or a bad movie. It's a good or a bad viewing experience. So I went and saw Frida with my wife and her mom, who is a lover of painting and art. And I never drink coffee, and I had a little coffee, and the popcorn was really good. And it was the most perfect environment to watch a film and share it with my wife and her mother. And it was like, to me, the perfect viewing experience. Then I asked my friend, who's a really well-versed in film, he goes, nah, that film wasn't that good. So it gave me that perspective that doesn't really matter if the aesthetics say that's a great film, because you go to Ed Wood and say, Ed Wood's the worst director in Hollywood history, but if I show Plan 9 from Outer Space and it sells out and everybody yells and whoops up that and has a good time during the whole screening, what's the purpose? The cinema, that wasn't Ed Wood's motive maybe, but if he was sitting there and everybody was reacting in a positive spirit, he might have gone, wow, I did something good, Well,
as an academic, I ask my academic friends to please forgive me for what I'm about to say, but I really get tired of academic discourse on cinema because so often it's just, first off, there's two forms of it. One of them, of course, is this is a great film. This is not a great film. This is, Then the other one is, you like that film? Did you not realize that it was just another cowboy and Indians movie and different guys? That's how they would deal with something like Avatar or something like that. Yeah. Which meant to say, you're not supposed to enjoy that film. You know that, right? You're not supposed to. And at the same time, like something I learned a long time ago. I remember it was Bruce Beresford, I think, the Australian director, made a little film about Native Americans up in Canada. I can't remember, the Black Robe or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was a nice film. It was a good film. And of course the critics liked it and the academics liked it because it was small and well acted and so forth and so on. But I looked at that film and I saw much the same stuff in terms of distorted images that I saw in Dances with Wolves.
Right.
But because it was small budget and nobody was making a whole lot of money off of it and so forth and so on, it must be a great film. And I just find that tedious. I mean, first off, I really don't believe, I'm not against it because we all have things that we like and things we don't like.
Yeah.
But I don't put much value on it. I think I told you that last time too, is that, if you're going to tell me something, don't tell me, what, you like that?
Right.
I mean, I don't, and for me about the reviewers, it's like, I don't pay a lot of attention to reviewers, frankly, but I've usually ended up picking out a few that I use because we're synchronized in some way. And I did that for a long time with Peter Travers.
Yeah.
Because there were films that I felt like, this looks like it's going to be interesting to me. And then I'd read the reviews and like, oh, it's terrible. Oh, it redoes the same thing over and over, And then I would go read Peter Travers and he said, this is really an interesting film.
Yeah.
And that would say, okay, I got to see it. And occasionally I didn't quite get the same thing out of it, but usually I found that we were in sync, and I was just looking for a reason to sort through all the films that come out. I can't see them all,
No, it's a good way to suss the big picture. And Pat, the other thing you said, remind me, Joe Morgenstern just retired from the Wall Street Journal, and he's been writing for him for like 25, 30 years. And I find his writing good. And he, I listen to him on the radio sometimes. And it's an interesting last column. Like, I've watched films for 25 years, free to make I get a living to watch films and, what a life. But, right when I started, everybody was saying cinema's dead. And then he says, well, it wasn't that dead. I had a pretty good career. But just to go back, that academic discourse thought, does that apply to literature as well? Pretty much. It's not exclusive to film, or is it?
Well, no, it does apply to literature. And let me be honest about something. I'm as guilty as the next person. Okay. I mean, I've done things, I've written, the first book I ever wrote on Ulysses was described by one critic as, quote, the first feminist reading of Ulysses. And I never knew that I was doing the first feminist reading of Ulysses. I was just, using the material that I was reading at the time, all the different kinds of theoretical stuff. I was using psychoanalysis, Marxism, feminism, whatever came to hand, to explore Ulysses. And I'm not necessarily against that, but I think that things tend to become, the academic world tends to become formulaic, and just as films can be formulaic, And sometimes I just get tired of it because I feel like people think that when they say, something is no good, that they've said something that matters. And I don't think so. I mean, I have to see for myself, and I can't see every film. But the films that I like are often films that people have ignored. I told you, I think last time, that I thought Cloud Atlas was brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought it was an amazing film and I read the novel after I saw the film. Let me make that clear. But what made that film so remarkable was how it was edited.
Yeah.
I mean, and to have pulled that off with the facility that they did, to have had so many cuts that created a kind of logic within the film was amazing. Now, there were flaws in the film. I thought that casting Tom Hanks turned out to be, in my view, kind of a flaw. I thought he, I just thought it would have been better to have somebody who was a little less of a superstar type figure. I mean, Hanks can occasionally do a good performance. I'm not going to knock him for that, but that's, to me, that's moot. I mean, no work of art, as I said last time, is ever perfect. There's always going to be something in it that you can see a problem with. I remember the first time I read For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway.
Yeah.
I thought, this is terrible. I couldn't believe he was doing something with English. And I realized later he must have been trying to make it conform to a kind of Spanish or something. I don't know. He decided to use some kind of particular style in that novel.
Yeah.
And I just found it to be kind of artificial. But then, some years later, I went back and read it and thought, well, it's better than I thought, actually. And you just can't trust all your judgments that way. But we all have different ways of looking at things. And when I write, what I'm trying to do is to make an argument for what I see in the film, what I experience in the film. And to my mind, it's not that I'm telling somebody how they're supposed to see it, but it becomes something that you lay on top of all the other arguments, of all the other debates and discussions and things that people have said. And you're making a contribution to that dialogue.
Yeah.
But that dialogue has no end. I mean, it just goes on. And, so when you say, I didn't like that film, that doesn't mean that much. I mean, give me an argument, and preferably an argument that isn't obviously predictable, such as, James Bond is a sexist.
Yeah.
That's a misogynist film. I mean, yeah, it probably is. I mean, obviously is in certain respects. But, for example, Casino Royale struck me as a remarkable film when I saw it. I didn't expect it to be as remarkable as it was. Then it was followed by a film that was terrible in my view. But I didn't really care. What I was interested in was why the first film worked so well, why it was so interesting. And,
what you do is what we strive for is the hidden psychic effects. It's the surface is you want to go to your friend or your newspaper movie critic and go, is this film good or bad? That's what we want, the Roger Ebert, Siskel thing, thumbs up or thumbs down. I mean, now it's just completely exaggerated in social media. But there is this thing Marshall totally pushed that I've said before is suspended judgment. Yeah, I'm going to give you my bias. I'm going to give you my point of view, but let's get deeper. Why does that exist? So, and I think it's back to our theme, which we can circle back around to for a little, because I wanted to bring up a couple little things that really touch on everything you've said so far. And I appreciate it because what I like is you're very articulate, and you, at the same time as being intellectual, you have emotion and passion in your sensibility. It's not just dry academia. And that's why McLuhan got in so much trouble, because he didn't always stay intellectual. He got jokey and he got feeling wise, and people wanted him to hold to his point. What do you mean you agree with me? You were starting off disagreeing with me. He was like, they would call him a charlatan. But this is this thing about violence being a search for identity. And I listen to Alan Watts every Sunday morning, and it was amazing. Today he did this piece called What is Reality? I recommend everybody go on YouTube and listen to it. It's 60 minutes of just fun, playful Eastern thought mixed with Western philosophies. He's not telling you how to think. He's saying we're all in flux, that we're always changing. And you don't want to just say, oh, you like that film? How could you like that film? Everybody knows it's trash. But, this thing about search for identity. So what Marshall said, that is ordinary people find the need for a violence as they lose identity. It's a threat. So like terrorists, hijackers, mass shooters are determined to make it somehow, or to get coverage, or to get noticed. This thing is like we're searching for identity. Oh, I'll tell you a good example. I met this woman. She said, I'm in film production. I goes, oh, really? So we start talking film. She goes, I'm not a Criterion person. And I loved it. I says, I'm gonna write a whole lecture. Criterion. It's funny because
I didn't hear you there. You got blitzed out there.
I'll repeat it. You know what I mean when you say I'm not a Criterion person. For people listening, that's like Criterion is the label, that is the company that releases all the art films on DVD, and they do a very good job. So if you see, oh, this is a Criterion film, it's usually going to be what some people go, oh, it's a boring European film with subtitles. They're not, they want to put it in a category. And now, Criterion's releasing a lot of variety, but I just got a kick out of that. So it's just like her saying that, my friend saying that was it was forming an identity. So that you have that crowd, and so that sheeple mentality, which is okay because we all want to have some sort of universality or commonality in what we're going to put a lot of money into seeing. Why did all these people go see this film? Am I being left out? Maybe I should go see it because everybody's seeing it. And so then he brought up the word threat. And funny, I like to do the etymology on words. Threat comes from the word crowd, troop, oppression, menace, to trouble, weary, to push, press, squeeze, quarrel, and conflict. So that the root of the word means a lot of things, but we generally think threat means there's some conflict. So then that led to a writer, James Ponowuskik. He writes the TV critic for the New York Times. And I found this one article he wrote in December 13th of 2017, really summarized what I'm trying to get to. He said, conflict means urgency. And urgency means viewers glued to the channel. So he was talking about the cable news business model. And I always say this could apply to anything. Why does everybody need to go see this one film? Because there's some urgency that comes about. So here's the cover of the New York Times today. And it was amazing because it was basically saying how Tucker Carlson stroked white fear to conquer cable news.
Yeah.
So it's that cable news model. And then he said, this is a machine. James is writing, this is back 5 years ago. It's a machine designed to generate stress. So that's what we're all going through. Ukraine war boiled down. Is there one button on Putin's desk that he's going to push, and then our planes are going to go, oh no, he pushed the buttons, now our planes. I mean, people are literally freaking out, and it's, I don't know if it's valid freak out. The machine is designed to generate stress and negative emotion. And then this was the era of Trump, and he said Trump knows that fighting is humankind's most productive state. Mm-hmm. So again, this thing of violence. So is that why cinema or literature has explored violence? Because it's humankind's most productive state. I'm not asking you to agree, but just again, hear it out. I'm almost done. So it keeps us trapped in a mindset of being a cable news junkie or a movie junkie or a literature junkie, whatever we're addicted to. And it's a feedback loop, create the disease, offer the cure. And the punchline he says is, even if they're not watching, because you get it from secondhand smoke. So, if you don't, like, I'll give you, you brought up Avatar. I thought Avatar was a good example. It's when it came out, it was the biggest event in cinema history ever. Mm-hmm. It was pro Mother Nature, anti the man, and anti-war. Mm-hmm. And everybody came out of the movie basically when the special effects were great. They didn't go, oh my God, my life has changed, I'm going to be pro Mother Nature and anti-war. So
go ahead.
So anyways, you didn't have to go see Avatar. People would talk to you about it. It's like secondhand smoke. So any ideas about this, just coming back to our sort of theme of violence is a search for identity, and violence in cinema, violence on TV, violence in literature. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you refer to Avatar because, the thing that when I went to see that, the thing that I was interested in is that I'm very much a student of William Blake.
Oh my God.
William Blake. And Blake has these figures that he uses. One of them has to do with, it's simply the word fiber, fibers. And he's talking about human connectivity, how humans, are bonded to one another, and how, like, for example, he refers to in his point, I think it's in Jerusalem primarily, the one man, Jesus Christ, who he makes clear is not simply the person who may have existed, 2,000 years ago, but is the whole human being. Every human being as one being, one person. Yeah. And so the idea that the trees and the plants contained human thoughts that were like a colossal brain, into which these people were plugged in. To me, that was a really interesting thought. Now I could see that, once again, you've got this like white male who's going to come in and say people of color, in this case, they're blue,
Yeah.
But, I guess what I would say is that I look for small details. The fact that he is, in fact, a disabled person.
Yeah.
Who is giving up his identity. He's changing his identity. He's becoming other. He's becoming something else. And, the movie, I think the original release, there's so many different versions now and I kind of like the long version, but at the beginning, in the original movie, I think it began with his eyes opening. Okay. This close up of his eyes opening. Seeing, he's actually arriving at the space station, and they do a few flashbacks and so forth. And then at the very end, the very last shot is he opens his eyes as a completely different person, a different species.
Yeah.
And so it was all about seeing, about vision, sight.
Vision.
And so to me, yeah, I can see that. I'm not saying that people are completely wrong to see yet another version of Fort Apache or something.
Yeah.
But you have to look at the little details. What makes, for example, genre films, and let's face it, movies, Hollywood movies tend to be in one genre or another. What makes genre films interesting to me is precisely the way in which they take a genre that has some archetypal structure to it, that's repeated, but they change something. They alter it just a little bit sometimes quite a bit, and in a way that it becomes a commentary not only on the thing it's about, but on the genre itself, and the way it operates. And now, do these directors do this consciously? I mean, when I was writing on Titanic, I actually sent the first draft of the essay to no, actually, I sent the published essay to Cameron's office, and with the proposal that I publish this essay, and he can respond to it, and then we can have like an interview. I've never done an interview in my life, but I was going to suggest that we simply do a distance interview where I would give some questions and he could respond to them. Anyway, they just he's off writing, and that was the end of that. And I wasn't surprised. I wasn't really expecting him to do that. But it was interesting to me, like that I'd read enough interviews, and the stuff he said in the interviews was kind of shallow. It was like, oh yeah, there's a Marxist dimension to this and this and that, so forth and so on. But it doesn't matter to me that he has some in-depth understanding, of what I see in the film, because if I see it in the film and if I can make an argument, I can say, okay, look at this shot. What does this say to you? And so forth and so on, just like you would do with the text, and if I can make that argument reasonable, so that, then I feel like I have opened up something in the film that, someone else might have been missing. And I think sometimes if you go to a film and your first thought is, this is obviously going to be another version of a Hollywood imperialist, colonialist formula, then you're not going to see what's there, and sometimes that's exactly what it is. I can't deny that. And, but there, I told you last time that, I wrote, I think I told you that, maybe I didn't. I was talking to another friend through Zoom, so I might get them mixed up. But I wrote a book on Ishmael Reed.
Did you really? Wow, yeah. I didn't know that.
And what inspired me to write that book was simply that one day I was talking to one of my colleagues, and he said Ishmael Reed's a fascist.
Wow.
And I at that time I'd only read one novel by Ishmael Reed, but I thought that's not what I got out of it, So I went and just read every novel he'd published at that time, and as much of everything else I could find, and I also at my university there some people had organized a boycott of him when he came to give a talk, which I just thought was kind of ridiculous. I just didn't agree with it, but it didn't really, he gave the talk anyway and people came anyway. So it was no big deal. And I did find that some of his novels had elements of misogyny in them. Okay. But what was funny was that the novel that most people identified it as his most misogynist novel was a novel called Reckless Eyeballing, which people took as a sort of a satire or a parody or a take off on I have a hard time with names these days. The color Alice Walker, The Color Purple.
Alice Walker, yeah.
And I read it very differently. I saw it as actually his most feminist book. That he was actually doing something far more complicated and ironic in the book. Related to racism, visuality. The whole history of, reckless eyeballing, of Black people looking at white women, Black men looking at white women, and then being lynched or killed or punished in some way.
Yeah.
And the point being, again, is that I just find that in academia sometimes, and I'm sure in other professions as well, if you approach things with too rigid of a political, paradigm, you're not going to see things, and you're going to see only what you want to see that supports that perspective. And I'm not saying it's a bad perspective, but that doesn't mean there aren't things worth recovering, from these films, because millions of people are seeing these films, and it's worth the trouble to try and figure out what they're seeing, and if it's really all negative. And to me, that's just an important thing. I even consider it a kind of redemption. It's a one of my big terms in my own film criticism and all my criticism is the notion of contradiction. Yeah, and which to some extent I take from a Marxist background, but I really see it as sort of fundamental. Is that if you live in a world in which the dominant, as Marx would say, the mode of production, but I would really conclude the mode of cultural production, is built on certain kinds of contradictions, then contradiction is inherent in the nature of art. And the German philosopher Adorno actually described art as, I think this isn't his exact words, but something along the lines of it, a work of art imminently conveys contradictions. It's the imminent expression of contradictions. Yeah. And so for me, every work of art to some extent is going to reflect the contradictions of the culture from which it emerges. Yeah. And how it negotiates those contradictions, not to resolve them, because you can't resolve them without changing the world. And which becomes an argument for trying to change the world if you want to really resolve those contradictions. But to shoot down everything that doesn't conform to a pre-established idea of a solution, when that idea is nothing more than a prescription, it's always seemed to me, missing the point, that there's so much more to be, salvaged from popular works of art that would be of value to learn, to experience, Anyway.
Yeah, Patrick, that's the big picture. That's McLuhan saying understanding is not having a point of view. We think understanding is I like this or I dislike it. No, it's understanding the big point of view. You can have a bias and a point of view, but understanding, getting the big picture is not having a point of view. I love that. And in fact, Marshall summed it up and Woody knew what to put. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong? And so I've got to comment on Ishmael Reed for a second, because he's a hero to me. My friend Walter Board and him started the first underground newspaper in America called East Village Other. And if you haven't read it, did you read the New Yorker article on Ishmael Reed in the last, half a year?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Oh, it's mind blowing.
It's in the New York Times. I'll look it up.
New Yorker.
Oh, the New Yorker. Okay.
Yeah. If you don't get the New Yorker, Jay could send you a link to it, because the New Yorker charges you.
Yeah, I know. I have several subscriptions, but not to the New Yorker.
Okay, but anyways, I'll have Jay send it to you.
Sometimes I can find things on the web, though, if I know they're there.
If you can find it, great. But it is worth reading, because there's a lot of contradiction, and your words were amazing. It's not to resolve contradiction, is how you negotiate, how you navigate. Because your love of Marty is enabling me to see a bigger picture. It's instead of me staying on my bias. Oh, they suck. I discount the Coen brothers. Oh, the Coen brothers are just Preston Sturges wannabes. And if I told them that, they'd go, thanks for the compliment. And people go, no, they're better than that. And that's what I want. I want them to tell me, why is my bias wrong, so I can get a bigger picture. I'm really trying to do that. And what you talked about in again, talking about so many of my heroes, William Blake said, "We become what we behold."
That's absolutely it. Yeah,
And that is completely McLuhan. He is so Blakean.
Yeah.
Well,
McLuhan referred to Blake. I mean, he talked about Blake.
He's huge.
I mean, it's all over the place.
And we study. If you want to join us every Monday night, we study Carl Jung, and our leader is a total William Blakean, and it's so healthy. But it's Whitman too. I contain multitudes. So it's that and I loved your use of the word other, because Frank Zappa has a song that goes, "We are the other people." And see that the otherness is an important thing. We want to be all together and go, "Oh, those are the other people." But it's worth reflecting on that. What you brought up was, you take a genre and that gives us the form. Oh, I'm familiar. Then if the filmmaker messes with the form, then they're messing with the content a little. But if they, it's sort of like what the Coen brothers do. I think they mess with the genre a little, the genre form. But to me, they're just like doing something that's already been done enough. But they are very talented at messing with the genre form.
Yeah.
And then their content, they're fine. They're great writers and they're great actors, and they can fill the content fine, So it's funny, because to me, what you did with Cameron is so important. It didn't matter if Cameron said yes to your interview thing. It's that you did it. See, that's what's important, is you did it and put it out there and say, "Here's some questions."
Yeah.
It's
I mean, if I could say something autobiographical, I mean, what you said earlier about the fact that I kind of surrender to films and then do a second take and third and fourth take. Yeah. But that's really true, because I told you before, I wrote a long essay on The Crying Game. And occasionally I've heard from a few of my, not necessarily people at my school, but people in the field who said, "Why do you have to write such a long essays?" But what I'm trying to do, I saw The Crying Game and I was blown away. That doesn't happen to me very often anymore. It did happen a lot when I was young, but not now. It takes something unusual to really psych me out, and the same thing happened with, the thing about Titanic is that before Titanic even came out, I was watching the previews at the theater, and I looked over at my wife and I said, "I see what he's doing. This whole thing is a figure for class society and the desire to destroy it, to send it to the bottom of the sea." Now, I was completely leaving out the idea that Cameron is also just a guy who's really into technology. He's into water. He's into the actual Titanic down there, trying to find it, go visit it, so forth and so on. I just was seeing what I saw on the screen. But when I saw the film, I was not disappointed. And of course, I saw the romance, and there was no question about that. And it was a not very original romance. And I never, by the way, have thought of Cameron as a particularly great writer.
Right.
But I think he has a visual imagination that is, and a sense of cinematic rhythm that makes his films, really fascinating. And I do think he has a vision, and it is kind of a Blakean vision. Yeah. And other people don't seem to see that. And that's, the argument that I've been trying to make. So, but I do surrender to movies. And if I can,
but that's what's good. We should. We want to see, if we go too critically, and I would tell you, I want to find the films, because I don't even want to watch films anymore. And I know what my wife wants to watch, so we'll put it on, and then I try to surrender to it. Mm-hmm. And then usually I fall asleep after 10 minutes, and that's fine. And we go to, we used pre-COVID, we would go to plays right down the street. We have a really good theater. Orson Bean was the head there. it's all these Hollywood actors who do like Chekhov and
Mm-hmm.
really Harold Pinter plays. They're really well written plays. They're well acted. And when I sit there, I'm looking at the set, in this little tiny theater. I'm looking at the actors, and I'm sort of going, I'm not going to surrender to this because I'm too much of a, like you, a critical thinking nerd, but I want to surrender. And it's so good, I usually surrender immediately. And when it's done, I was like, I didn't even pay attention to the set or the acting or anything. I got swooped into it. So I allow myself to get swooped in because that's what you want art to do, to swoop you in. And you brought up Poe, Poe coming out of Mallarmé saying, don't paint the thing itself, paint the effect it produces. Like it's Poe just giving you so many little details, then you fill in the rest. Or, Cameron giving you a little, even though he's bombarding you, you can suss it out and go, I'm going to surrender to this, and then critically think and pull back. But I'm curious because writing and vision are two really important things, and not many filmmakers were both the writer and the visionary. I find Preston Sturges really revolutionized that, where he's saying, I'm not going to surrender to these directors anymore. And he made he really did good, I think, writing films like Lady Eve, and directing. I mean, he had a vision, and he sort of did what I call alchemy. He came up with a new genre. He took literate and comedy and came up with the screwball comedy. But I was curious. There's one guy who I've really been influenced by, and his name is Chris Marker, especially a film called Sans Soleil.
Yeah. It's been a while, but I've seen it. I mean, I know who he is and everything.
Yeah, because he to me has a vision, and his writing, even though it's not thought of as being written, because it's, an essay film is like a fake documentary. Well, it's actually like a fake documentary. So it's sort of like his writing. You can read the text for Sans Soleil online, and it's pretty amazing, I think. But I recommend it to people, and they never give me feedback. But I think this has been really productive, and I appreciate it. We can go anywhere in concluding, because I think this is important. Having the search for identity as our theme, because it's sort of like you've laid your cards on the table and said, yeah, I do surrender to these, but then I step back and I have critical thinking. And it's not bad that people surrender to the film experience and they don't have critical thinking. It's just, it's a pop artifact. And it's like Billy Wilder saying, I just hope they like my film as much as they like the popcorn.
Let me demystify the critical thinking a little bit, though, because
please,
one of the things that the right does, the conservative movement does, that they're always like saying, oh, you scholars just go in looking for you go in looking for what you want,
right?
You have preconceived notions, and then you find what you want. And the thing is, there's a partial truth to that. And I mean, obviously, any fool can see that the conservatives always find exactly what they're looking for, no matter what they look at. The truth is that, like, for example, when I watch a movie, I do have impulses. I do have. You can call them biases. I would simply call them desires. Is that I'm concerned.
Good.
I am concerned about issues like class. All these identities that we concern are with gender identity, so forth and so on, justice, democracy. I mean, these things matter to me, And yes, when I see a film, when someone tells me, okay, the Western is a conservative genre, it's male-centered, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And then I look at the Western and I think, wait a minute, as a genre, what is this really about? And it doesn't seem to be too false of a generalization to say it's pretty much about property.
Yeah.
Even when you're talking about the Indian Western, it's about this conflict over the earth.
Yeah.
Over who gets to possess it, in what way do they possess it. And that doesn't seem to me to be conservative, No. Even talking about it. And then, obviously there are conservative dimensions. So yes, when I surrender, I'm also surrendering to myself. I know that there are things that move me and there are other things that don't move me. And when I see a film that really lifts me up, gives me a sense of like, wow, this is really powerful. I told you that Les Miserables, the film Les Miserables, affected me that way. But when I saw it on the stage, it did not affect me that way.
Yeah.
When I saw it on the stage, it felt like a procession, whereas when I saw it on film, it had a story and a visual eye. What I loved about that guy, Tom, oh Christ, whatever his name is,
right.
He's got this very subtle but very visual eye. And there's a scene, for example, where the actor is singing, a song about God above, and in the background there's an eye painted on the wall, And just little things like that where you can tell this director is plotting out each frame, And what is it about? It's about revolution. It's about transformation. And it's about passion, And, and the funny thing is, after I saw that movie, I actually read Les Miserables in French. And that is no easy task for somebody who is not a fluent reader. I read fairly fluently, but it's work for me.
Yeah.
And, it's a very different experience, I admit, reading that novel, because a lot of it is almost encyclopedia expedient. It's almost Joycean, in fact, in a sense that you have this man who's a kind of everyman, common man, very different from Leopold Bloom, obviously, or, whatever you think is at the center of Finnegan's Wake. But it's still a totally different experience from the film and the music. Because I think the music is partially what makes it, so powerful. So yes, I have something I'm looking for. There's no question about that. And what my argument would be, what are you looking for? Because it's there. Yeah. So if millions of people are going to this film and they're walking away feeling something, some emotion, I have to believe part of that is because there is an element in them that I share, that we share this vision to some extent.
Yeah.
And I think Yoko Ono is a bit too optimistic to my mind. I wish it was going to be that easy, but I do think that in small steps, we enhance our consciousness, when we can. And obviously there are betrayals and setbacks and, so forth and so on. But, I still believe that for the most part, art contributes to the process of transformation. Yeah. And I believe that cinema is an art, and that some cinematic works, I think, have an incredible aesthetic intensity and others less so. But that doesn't mean there isn't something of value in almost everything, Anyway, that's that thing of value.
It is important, and it reminds me a little of Gary Snyder, the nature beat poet, who said, "My task as a poet entails seeing the world without language, then bringing that seeing into language." So you can't abandon your language, your makeup, your past experiences. When you pick a movie by the title, by the star, or you just trust, I got a new movie to put in, let's watch it. You want to know that you're going to carry some baggage with it. And I think it's an important question. What you posed was, what's the difference between desires and bias? They're very similar in a lot of ways, and they set up, you can't deny who you are and what you're coming to that movie with, And so I think to surrender to yourself is really important. But again, I'm curious how that goes to the quote Jay gave us from the poet Fanny Howe. The point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't. Does that resonate at all with this?
Well, it does. I would have to modify it a little bit. I mean,
please, how would you modify?
I mean, because you're going to get me into say something that's getting a little too complicated. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to grab one.
There are basically, I'm told, three forms of logic.
Okay,
there's
go
classical
ahead.
logic. In classical logic, you have the principle of non-contradiction and the excluded middle, i.e., A and not A cannot both be true. Yeah. And there's nothing between A and not A. Okay. Yeah. And then there's intuitionistic logic, which basically says that A and not A cannot both be true, but there's something in the middle.
Yeah.
And I would argue that intuitionistic logic is actually the logic that we tend to use on an everyday basis. Because, it's, and then there's this, I forget the name of the third one now. It's got a very strange name, anyway, it's logic. And it's basically that A and not A can both be true. But there's no middle ground, but A and not A can in fact both be true in some way.
Both be true, yeah.
And I think that would be like a kind of like a psychological state of ambivalence where you can't move out of a situation. But all I would say is that now I'm losing my thread here. What were we talking about before?
Well, no, it's really important what you brought up, because that intuitive, those three elements of logic, or three interpretations of logic. Please tell me where you got that sometime, like email me.
It actually, I got that from Badiou. I've mentioned him before.
Oh, Badiou. I looked him up.
But he didn't invent that. There actually are the three types of mathematical logic, and
well, we'll look it up. I'm just curious the roots, but it's
they sometimes go by different names. Those are the names he uses.
Yeah, but the second, that's good. But the second one, intuitive, is really
it's not intuitive. It's intuitionistic, because it's not really about intuition in the way we usually use the term. It's just I don't know why they came up with that name.
Well, I think if you're going to say it's the middle, it's the one we use the most. It is the difference between percept and concept. Words evoke more than their meaning. Concept means you're conned into believing that's the way something is. And nothing is the way it is. It's always in flux, but we use words to define things. Percept is intuition, in impulse, feelings, hunches, guesses. And McLuhan said it. He says the gap is where the action is, in the middle.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about justice. I mean, the law. You go into a courtroom and somebody's either innocent or guilty. But the reality is that we know that it's more complicated than that.
It's more
that someone can be a little guilty and quite innocent. And that's where the maybe the Bonnie and Clyde thing would come in. Is that not the real people, because I think it's a mistake to assume that the art form is talking about real people. That real persons, but it is talking about real people in the sense of, well, let me put it this way. When Richard Wright wrote Native Son, he shocked a lot of people, including a lot of Black people, because his main character, is not a good person, superficially. And yet he was not trying to demonize this character. To make him absolutely bad. He was trying to show that you create a world like this, and this is what comes out of it.
That's it.
And that's what I would see as intuitionistic logic, that bigger is, good in some ways, but not, you can't really say he's somewhere in the middle. He's an anomaly, something that's can't, you can't deal with unless you face the fact that there's something besides the positive and the negative, somewhere in the middle. And, I just think that that's how I look at most art, is that it's but I don't mean middle in the sense of compromise. You know what I'm saying? I don't mean.
I totally know what you mean. Yeah. It is. It's the big picture. It's comprehensiveness. Mm-hmm. But it's Pascal. He said, in order to understand anything, you have to know this end of the spectrum and that end and everything in between. Again, high aspiration. But, I really want to do one of these on Joyce someday in the future too, because we barely touched the surface on Joyce and Ishmael Reed. After you read that New York article on Ishmael Reed and something on Ulysses, but just in closing out here, Patrick, I want to thank you for your time in teaching me so much. I've learned so much, but there's a couple poets I wanted to quote in closing and just get your thoughts on it. E. Cummings said, "To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight and never stop fighting." That's like, something about violence as identity. I was curious, any comments on that idea by E. Cummings, being a poet too?
I'm almost afraid to start because it would become a dissertation. That is such a rich comment, and there's so many ways to respond to it. I would just say that there's, on the one hand, we are always being objectified in a certain way, being put into groups, categories, and so forth and so on. But on the other hand, we are nothing until we know something.
Yeah.
And Good. We only know something through others.
Yeah.
So it's the difference, I think, between, for example, blindly following a leader who tells you what to think and, reading 100 books. And you're obviously submerging yourself in others, but you are trying to arrive at, some kind of truth that comes out of that. So I think Cummings, I'm not sure I agree with what Cummings was saying there, but it's worth saying because it gives you a lot of thought, something to work with,
It's a lot of thoughts because it's like, I don't want to promote, I think we're both pacifists. I don't want to promote using the word fighting because it's like surrendering to their method. It's like when people have the bumper sticker, "Kill your TV." It's like, I don't want the word kill. Say something like, turn it off, or, watch, look at paintings, but don't say kill your TV. Anyways, I think
Blake said mental fight.
Mental fighting. That's what it is. Yeah.
So I think I believe it. I kind of believe in mental fight, but
yeah. No, and it's good because Breck has a statement too, about hammers and whatever weaponry, and he doesn't mean physical weaponry, but he uses it metaphorically. And all words are metaphorical. All language is metaphor. And I think it's important you recognize that difference that Marshall said, that, hey, I don't want to promote violence. I want to promote dialogue. And so dialogue is like the campfire. And, that's what we did. We fired up this Zoom salon, and fire is like firing a gun. So it's like, well, what did we choose, to fire a gun or fire up the lights for a Zoom salon? Mm-hmm. And so this metaphor is like light. It basically comes to light. Mm-hmm. Fire is light, is the campfire. And I've been truly enlightened. But I'm just going to read this little part from my book. It says, my friend said that poetry is candid. He said that poetry is candor. Mm-hmm. And candid conjures up the word candor. And candor means openness of mind, freedom from reserve or disguise. Candor comes from the word meaning whiteness, or brightness,
Mm-hmm.
which sort of illustrated our time together, was to burn the white light of dialogue to expose the center without the margin, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And Joyce called that impulse towards candor the Edimhilization of the Edom. Or maybe you know that word. The
what?
Abnihilization of the Edom in Finnegan's Wake, which basically it meant the making of something out of nothing. You have a lot of experience. I'm not
making something out of nothing.
Yeah, but we made a lot out of. But here's Louis Buñuel, just to close out. Mystery is a basic element of all art works of art. Octavia Paz has said, but that a man in chains should shut his eyes, the world would explode. And Louis Buñuel, he says, I could say, but the white eyelid of the screen reflects its proper light, the universe would go up in flames. But for the moment we can sleep in peace, the light of cinema is conveniently docified and shackled. What's DOCIFIED mean?
Docified. I'm not sure what that means. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, the light of cinema is shackled. So it's sort of like the point I was trying to make. It was like is candor. It implies fire, enlightenment. So I really appreciated your time here, Patrick. You really enlightened me. And let's do another on Joyce and Ishmael Reed and continue the dialogue.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed it too. So
yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.